Right then, lads and lasses, have you ever read something and thought, hold on a tick, what in God's name does mean? Well, you're not alone. The Good Book, as they call it, has sparked more debates than a pub quiz on a Friday night. We're diving headfirst into the most controversial Bible verses. These aren't your average Sunday school verses. These are the ones that make you scratch your head, the ones that have theologians throwing their dictionaries at each other. Buckle up, because we're about to tackle the verses that have puzzled believers and skeptics for centuries. Now, before you think this is just some theological nitpicking, let me tell you these verses matter. They've shaped history, sparked wars, and continue to influence how we view morality today. From the Ten Commandments to the teachings of Jesus, these verses are the bedrock of faith for millions. But here's the rub: interpreting them isn't always straightforward. Context, translation, even personal bias, it all comes into play. And that's where things get interesting. It's like trying to decipher a cryptic message from your nan. You know she means well, but sometimes you need a code breaker to figure out what she's on about. Over the next few minutes, we're going to unpack some of the most debated passages in the Bible. We'll look at the historical context, the different interpretations, and the impact they've had on the world. We're talking about verses on everything from sexuality to violence, from the role of women to the very nature of God. This isn't about finding easy answers. It's about grappling with the tough questions, about engaging in thoughtful discussion. It's about understanding that faith, like life, is rarely black and white. So, grab a cuppa, put your thinking caps on, and let's get stuck in. Now then, let's not underestimate the power of these scriptures, eh? These words, passed down through generations, have shaped empires and inspired revolutions. From the halls of power to the humblest homes, the Bible has left its mark. Think about it. Kings have been crowned in its name, laws have been written based on its verses, and countless souls have found solace and guidance in its pages. It's a testament to the power of words. In it, how a few lines can echo through centuries, shaping beliefs, values, and entire civilizations. A tapestry of interpretations unraveling the threads. But here's the thing about the Bible, and indeed any sacred text, it's open to interpretation. It's like a right good tapestry, see? Up close, you might see one thread here, another there. But step back, and a larger picture emerges. Over the centuries, folks from all walks of life have looked at these verses and seen different things. Some see absolute truths etched in stone, others find poetry, metaphor, lessons whispered between the lines, and that's where the real debate begins. The peril of literalism, reading between the lines. Now, some folks take the Bible literally, every word a divine decree, and while there's nothing wrong with faith, taking everything at face value can lead to a bit of a sticky wicket. See, language evolves. What might have been crystal clear to folks back in the day could sound like Charlie Brown's teacher to us lot. We need to consider the historical and cultural context, the symbolism and metaphors, the whole shebang. It's like trying to understand Shakespeare with a 21st century dictionary. You might get the gist, but you'll miss the nuances, the poetry, the true brilliance of the bard. Context is king time, place, and meaning. That's why context is king, my friends. It's like finding a fiver in your old jacket. A pleasant surprise, but it makes more sense when you remember that gig you went to last year. When a verse was written, where it was written, who it was written for, it all matters. Take, for instance, those verses about shellfish. Back in the day, without refrigeration, that was sound advice for avoiding a dodgy tummy. But today, well, let's just say I'm rather fond of a good prawn cocktail. Understanding the context helps us separate the timeless truths from the time-bound customs. It allows us to engage with the text on a deeper level, to appreciate its wisdom without getting bogged down in outdated interpretations. Controversial company meeting our first contenders. Right then, let's meet some of our contestants in this theological showdown, shall we? First up, we've got verses that seem to endorse violence, an eye for an eye and all that. Then there's the passages about slavery, which, let's be honest, make for some uncomfortable reading in the 21st century. And of course, we can't forget the verses that have sparked endless debates about the role of women, head coverings, submission, the whole 9 yards. These are just a taste of the controversial characters we'll be meeting today, each one a potential landmine in the field of faith. An eye for an eye? Wrestling with retribution. Now, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It's a bit Old Testament, isn't it? Sounds a bit like a pub brawl that gets out of hand. But before we start fitting everyone for eye patches, let's have a chinwag about context. Back in the day, this was revolutionary. It was about limiting revenge, stopping blood feuds from wiping out entire families. It was about justice, see? But fast forward a few thousand years and Jesus throws a right spanner in the works. Turn the other cheek, he says. Love your enemies. Suddenly, that eye for an eye business seems a bit barbaric, doesn't it? Slavery and scripture, a difficult conversation. Right, let's address the elephant in the room, shall we? Slavery. There are verses in the Bible that seem to condone it, and that's just a bitter pill to swallow, no sugarcoating it. But before we go chucking the good book out with the bathwater, let's remember that slavery back then wasn't quite the same as the horrors we associate it with today. Plus, there are also verses about treating slaves with respect, even passages that seem to advocate for their freedom. It's complicated, messy, and frankly a bit grim. Women in the Word debating roles and rights. Next up, the fairer sex. Or as some of these verses would have it, the weaker sex. Ugh, makes me cringe just saying it. There's a lot of talk about submission, about women keeping silent in church, about head coverings and whatnot. Frankly, it's enough to make a bloke want to pour himself a stiff drink. But again, context is key. These verses were written in a time when women were treated more like property than people. And even then, there are stories of strong, powerful women in the Bible. Deborah, Esther, Ruth. These lasses were nobody's fool. They challenged the status quo and proved that women are a force to be reckoned with. Love thy neighbour, now love thy neighbour as thyself. It's a right corker of a commandment, isn't it? Sums up the whole shebang, really. Except, there always seem to be exceptions, don't there? Throughout history, folks have used the Bible to justify all sorts of nasty business, from discrimination to outright violence. It's enough to make you wonder if we're reading the same book. But here's the thing. Using faith to justify hate is like using a cricket bat to make a cup of tea. It's the wrong tool for the job. The Bible is full of stories about love, compassion and forgiveness, about breaking down barriers, not building them up. That's the message we should be taking to heart, the one that resonates with the very best of humanity. The chosen verse, a deep dive into controversy. Right then, let's have a proper go at one of these verses, shall we? We've got a whole buffet of controversy to choose from, but for this round we're tackling a real doozy. Romans chapter 1 verses 26 to 27. This one's caused more arguments than a spilled pint in a crowded pub. Now, I won't bore you with the whole passage, but in a nutshell it talks about same-sex relationships and God's supposed disapproval. It's been used to justify discrimination, to condemn folks for who they love. And frankly, it's caused a right mess. So put on your thinking caps, lads and lasses. We're about to dissect this verse like a frog in biology class. Unpacking the arguments, theological tug of war. Now, you've got folks on one side waving this verse like a winning lottery ticket. See? Black and white. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. They're quoting the Bible, chapter and verse, convinced that any other interpretation is heresy. But then you've got the other side scratching their heads, wondering if they're reading the same book. They're pointing to the bigger picture, to Jesus' message of love and compassion, to the fact that the Bible also condemns things like greed and gluttony. It's a theological tug of war, with each side pulling on their interpretation, convinced they've got the right end of the rope. Historical head scratchers, the when and why of it all. Here's where things get even more interesting, or should I say more complicated. See, when these verses were written, the concept of sexual orientation, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. It was a different time, a different culture with different social norms. Some scholars argue that Paul, the bloke who penned those words, was actually talking about something else entirely. Maybe he was referring to specific practices common in Roman society, or perhaps he was addressing a particular issue within the early Christian community. It's a bit like trying to understand why people used to wear powdered wigs. It made sense back then, but today it'd just look daft. Modern-day morality, bridging the gap. So, how do we bridge this gap between ancient text and modern morality? It's a question that's got folks tied up in knots. But here's the thing, we can't just ignore these verses, no matter how uncomfortable they make us feel. We need to grapple with them, to understand their historical context, and to interpret them in light of our own values. It's about having honest, open conversations, about listening to different perspectives, even when we disagree. It's about recognizing that faith isn't a static thing. It evolves, it adapts, it grows alongside our understanding of the world. The power of perspective. Whose interpretation reigns supreme? At the end of the day, lads and lasses, interpretation is a powerful thing. It can be used to build bridges or to erect walls. It can foster love and understanding or fuel hatred and division. With a verse like Romans chapter 1, verses 26 to 27, the stakes are high. Lives are on the line, hearts are at stake. That's why it's crucial to approach these debates with humility, with empathy, and with a willingness to listen. The Bible is a complex and challenging book, full of contradictions and ambiguities, but that's part of what makes it so compelling, so enduring. It forces us to confront our own biases, to question our assumptions, and to engage in the messy but ultimately rewarding work of interpreting faith in a constantly changing world. Beyond the surface, embracing nuance and complexity. Now you might be thinking, blimey mate, this Bible business is a right headache. Can't we just have a nice cuppa and forget about it? And I wouldn't blame you. It's tempting to shy away from anything that challenges our beliefs, that throws a spanner in our carefully constructed worldviews. But here's the thing. Life ain't always black and white, is it? There's a lot of grey area, a lot of messy bits that don't fit neatly into our preconceived notions. And faith, well, it's no different. The Bible, for all its wisdom and beauty, is a product of its time. It reflects the cultural norms, the social structures, the very language of a world long gone. To truly understand it, we need to dig deeper, to look beyond the surface and grapple with its complexities. The danger of dogma? When certainty becomes a cage. One of the biggest dangers we face, whether we're talking about faith or football, is dogma. This rigid adherence to a set of beliefs can be incredibly limiting. That unshakable belief that our way is the only way, that anyone who disagrees is wrong, misguided, or worse. It creates an environment where dialogue and understanding are stifled. It's a dangerous game, that, and it often leads to more harm than good. History is filled with examples of conflicts born from such rigid thinking. When we cling to rigid interpretations, when we refuse to acknowledge the possibility of multiple truths, we trap ourselves in a cage of our own making. This self-imposed prison limits our potential for growth and understanding. We shut out the light of understanding, the possibility of growth, the beauty of diverse perspectives. By doing so, we miss out on the richness that different viewpoints can bring to our lives. Faith, at its core, is about seeking, about questioning, about wrestling with the big questions of life and death, of meaning and purpose. It's a journey, not a destination. It's not about having all the answers, but about being brave enough to live in the questions, to embrace the mystery and wonder of it all. In this way, faith becomes a dynamic, living thing, constantly evolving and growing. Living the questions faith in the grey areas. Now, I'm not saying we should toss out the rule book altogether. There's a certain comfort in tradition, in the rituals and routines that have guided generations before us. But we also need to be willing to ask tough questions, to challenge our assumptions, to admit when we don't have all the answers. It's in those grey areas, those spaces where certainty gives way to curiosity, that faith truly comes alive. It's about acknowledging that the Bible, like life, is full of paradoxes and contradictions. It's about holding on to our beliefs with an open hand, willing to let go when necessary and embrace new understandings. It's about recognizing that our interpretations are just that, interpretations. They're shaped by our experiences, our upbringing, our hopes and fears, and they're constantly evolving as we journey through life. A call to compassion, love as the guiding light. So, where does that leave us then? In a world full of diverse interpretations and perspectives, if the Bible is open to interpretation, and if each person sees it through their own lens, if there's no one right answer, no single path to follow, what are we supposed to do? How do we navigate this complex journey? Well, lads and lasses, I reckon it all boils down to this: love, plain and simple. Love is the compass that guides us. When in doubt, choose love. Let it be the light that illuminates your path. When faced with a difficult verse, a challenging situation, ask yourself, what would love do? When engaging in debate, in conversation, let love be your guide. Let it shape your words and actions. The Bible, for all its complexities, is a love story at its heart. A story of divine love and human connection. It's about God's love for humanity, a love that transcends time and space, about our love for one another, a love that binds us together. And it's a story that's still being written, with each of us contributing to its pages, with each generation adding their own chapter. A chapter that reflects our times and our hearts. Let's make sure ours is a chapter filled with compassion, with understanding, with empathy, with a willingness to see the divine spark in every human being, to recognize their inherent worth, regardless of their beliefs or background. Let love be the guiding light in all we do. The takeaway. More questions than answers? Well, there you have it, lads and lasses. A right whirlwind tour through some of the most controversial verses the good book has to offer. We've wrestled with ancient laws, grappled with cultural context, and maybe even spilled a bit of tea along the way. It's been quite the journey, hasn't it? And if you're anything like me, you might be left with more questions than answers. But you know what? That's not a bad thing. In fact, it's a sign of growth and curiosity. I reckon it's a sign that we're engaging with these texts on a deeper level, that we're not just taking things at face value. We're digging deeper, searching for meaning. The Bible isn't some dusty old rule book meant to be memorized and blindly obeyed. It's much more than that. It's a living, breathing document full of wisdom, poetry, and yes, even a bit of controversy. And that's what makes it so fascinating, and it's up to each of us to wrestle with its meaning, to find the truths that resonate with our own lives. So keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going. Keep the conversation going. Your thoughts matter. Now, I'm just one bloke with a microphone and a penchant for theological pondering. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What are some of the most controversial Bible verses you've come across? How do you make sense of them in today's world? Head down to the comments section and let's have a right good chinwag about it. Remember, lads and lasses, respectful debate is a good thing. It helps us challenge our own assumptions, broaden our perspectives, and maybe even learn a thing or two along the way. So let's keep the conversation going, eh? Until next time the journey continues. Well, that's all the time we've got for today, folks. But remember, this is just the beginning of the journey. Exploring faith, wrestling with scripture, it's a lifelong adventure. And like any good adventure, it's full of twists and turns, surprises and challenges. If you're keen to delve deeper into the fascinating world of biblical interpretation, I've got a treat for you. Next week, we'll be tackling another thought-provoking topic. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out. Until then, keep those minds open, those hearts kind, and those questions coming. God bless you all. Bye.